In a matter of weeks, the world's youngest country has fallen apart. What began as a dispute over army promotions has turned into a war between neighbours. Thousands of buildings have been torched. Around 1 in 8 East Timorese have been driven from their homes. The police and army have broken up into rival camps. An Australian-led military force has had to fly in to hold this country together. It's a disaster for East Timor, but it's a disaster for the international community as well, because this was supposed to be their poster child, the proof that UN-guided nation building could work.
So this was one of your main timber.
I've come to see my old friend Edu, who's built one of the few successful indigenous businesses in East Timor, a furniture workshop.
Here in this place I have around 17 cubic meters of teak wood, and now nothing left. It was very sad for me.
He and his family have fled the violence to his hometown in the east. Today he's back in Dili to check how much has been looted in his absence. Inside are hundreds of desks he's been contracted to build for the country's new schools. Many have now been stolen.
To start building this business, it was very hard because I have to borrow money from the bank. And now there are many things stolen.
Edu's story is all the more poignant because he was jailed and tortured several times under the Indonesian occupation, but he survived and went on to employ nearly 80 people here, including Indonesian carpenters.
You fought against the Indonesians for 24 years, and you suffered a lot, and you were in prison and tortured, but you don't feel safe now in your own capital.
Yeah, it takes time a little while, I think. Maybe yes, it will be changed after a few months, I think. But now, at the moment, I don't feel safe.
Nor do tens of thousands of others. Huge camps have sprung up along the road heading east from Dili. People who thought the war was over when Indonesia left 7 years ago, now living on refugee handouts, too frightened to go home. Back in the capital, a shaky peace is holding, thanks to the presence of the International Intervention Force. These are troops from New Zealand. As so often in new nations, this crisis began in the army. It's a very young force, based on the guerrilla movement that fought for independence. It still relies on foreign training. Today, a fresh batch of NCOs is graduating, but a cloud hangs over the occasion. Nearly half the enlisted men, recruits from the West, were sacked back in February after going on strike. And they've since been involved in armed clashes with these loyal soldiers, clashes which also drew in much of the police force. The man about to become their new Prime Minister is here, along with their commanders. These are former guerrilla fighters who once enjoyed unrivaled respect. But the recent violence has raised serious questions about their proper role in a democratic East Timor.
By calling in the army, it alienated the police. The police felt betrayed, humiliated, angry, and many start fleeing the city with their weapons. And then a few weeks later, about roughly 3 weeks later, we began to have a confrontation between armed police and the loyal army. And I would say the army and the police ended up being victims of policy errors, judgments, decisions made by my government.
The confrontations culminated with a massacre of police officers in May. They'd already surrendered their weapons to UN mediators, but were fired on all the same. Well, this is the spot where those unarmed police officers were gunned down in cold blood by soldiers. It was perhaps the worst in a series of shockingly violent incidents which caused the disintegration of the security forces and split communities here between people from the east and the west of the country. So why has East Timor, the most ambitious and promising nation-building exercise ever undertaken by the United Nations, collapsed so quickly? There was never much to build with. Even today, the country is littered with ruins from the wholesale destruction carried out by Indonesian troops and militias. And the people of East Timor were ill-equipped to do much of the building themselves. Poorly educated and often traumatized by the long independence war, today most are trapped in abject poverty. These challenges might have been overcome, though, if the United Nations had done a better job of building the army and especially the police. But it left them half-formed, riven by internal rivalries and easily manipulated by ambitious politicians. At the army base, I found Lino Saldana, a deputy police commissioner now in hiding from his colleagues. He told me of his growing alarm as he watched the Interior Minister, Rogério Lobato, importing hundreds of sophisticated guns and handing them out to his supporters.
But when the weapons coming, the weapon distributed without any monitoring, without any control. And sometimes, not only commander, but minister also decide to distribute the weapon for the people they feel that can trust them.
Civilians?
Yes, even the civilian, like what you say, their reality already have evidence right now, and a lot of civilians carry the weapon. And this whole thing is a big disaster.
The Interior Minister has now been sacked and is being held here under house arrest. But the damage has been done. We drove up into the mountains to meet some of the men who received those guns. They had a disturbing tale to tell.
Well, we've now arrived at our destination, and this is the ruins of an old Portuguese fort deep in the mountains, and it's here that a man who's calling himself Commander Railos has been hiding and keeping a number of modern assault weapons that he says he was given by the Minister for Interior, and he's going to explain to us why. Bon dia.
Kalau untuk anak buah elemen saya.
He's a former guerrilla fighter who was sacked from the army 3 years ago, but he hasn't lost his appetite for military life.
Presentar! Arma! Ini misi ada armada.
He runs his own private militia up here. The independence struggle entrenched a warrior mentality in many Timorese men, and most don't have jobs. What they do have now, though, is guns from the police, given to them, says Commander Railos, for a sinister purpose.
Terutama misi kami yang pertama untuk melakukan itu.
We were ordered to join members of a special police unit,
sama URP untuk menghabisi.
And first, to finish off the sacked soldiers. Second, we were to finish off the other army officers who led the rebellion. And third, we were ordered to kill the leaders of the opposition parties.
Commander Railos has already agreed to hand over these weapons, but he has others. The proliferation of guns is a dangerous development for East Timor, and it took place while the country was officially still under international supervision. So what was the UN doing about it? I went to ask its representative in East Timor. His is a much reduced mission these days, but still wields a lot of influence.
Did you think it was a good idea to be encouraging the Interior Minister to create very heavily armed special units whose guns apparently have now gone missing?
I think at that time that the United Nations police force decided that as they are withdrawing, they have to be able to have a unit that can, in fact, address this kind of riot situations.
But
and I think
riots don't need assault weapons. I mean, the import of weapons for these units was surely completely inappropriate. You shouldn't have been sanctioning that.
I would say that at that time that there was a decision made that this kind of weapons were perhaps needed for the also for the border at that time.
But the return of foreign troops here, just 4 years after the UN handed over the reins of government, tells a different story. That the UN should have intervened more, that it cast off its responsibilities far too quickly.
The Security Council wanted quick fix solutions, wanted shortcuts to nation building because of cost. You cannot have an effective, viable small business, a restaurant in 2 years, let alone a whole country from ashes of destruction.
Although it was a small mission, it was...
The UN has tacitly acknowledged its recent mistakes by bringing in Ian Martin, the man who ran the much smaller but successful mission for the referendum here 7 years ago.
It was much more successful even than you expected at the time.
Yes, and I think that was largely due to the East Timorese. I mean, I think the United Nations can take a lot of credit for how quickly...
He and I revisited his old headquarters in Dili, now an Australian army base. Did he think the UN had failed in East Timor?
I think either success or failure are much too sweeping terms to apply. And one of the problems is that you apply them to expectations. The expectations were too high, and certainly success was declared on too superficial a basis.
By the UN and the international community?
By many people, yes, absolutely. But I don't think that means that now one simply rebrands it as a failure. In some ways, as I said to the Security Council, this can be a wake-up call, a recognition that a much longer-term approach is needed.
I went to see my friend Edu in his hometown Baucau and found him discussing his country's future with Colonel Falur. He's the third highest-ranking army officer and once a renowned guerrilla commander. He outlined a bleak scenario to me of continued civil war before the underlying conflicts here can be resolved. Edu was more hopeful.
The people of this country, after this 24 years, because we have enemies everywhere in Delhi, between East Timorese and between East Timorese and Indonesia. And
reconciliation is not finished yet.
Yeah, but the reconciliation process is not finished yet. But I think after we cross this reconciliation, this is the last reconciliation process thing.
But East Timor has taken a huge step backwards. Edu, the one-time furniture entrepreneur, is now clearing scrub with his relatives to try his hand at farming. It's not what he dreamed of when he helped his country to win its independence. But independence, as he and the rest of East Timor have discovered, is just the first step in the backbreaking task of building a nation.